Hello, for this video, we will go over two different arguments to see how to put them in the truth table. Here is our first argument. We see it listed horizontally there. I think it's easier to think about them vertically, so I will put that off to the right. So we have first premise, if P, then Q. Second premise is if Q, then R. And our conclusion is if R, then P. All right, so is this valid or invalid? That is the question we will answer using a truth table. All right, so the first thing we need to note is that we have three different sentence letters. We have P, Q, and R. And so that means that we will need to use 8 rows for our truth table. We're going to set up our base columns, P, Q, and R. And then we will set up our first premise over here. If P, then Q. I'm going to write P1 for premise 1. Second premise is if Q, then R. That's P2. And our conclusion, if R, then P. I'm going to write C for conclusion. All right. So that's at the top of our truth table. And now I'm going to set up my base columns for each of the 8 rows. So P is going to have 4 trues and 4 false. Q is going to have 2 true, 2 false, 2 true, 2 false, and R is going to alternate. True, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. All right, and then we can kind of divide that up so that we remember those are just our base columns. They're not part of what we'll be reading for the actual answer of whether this is valid or invalid. Okay, so for the first premise, this one's pretty straightforward because we have a conditional where the antecedent is P and the consequent is Q. So we're looking at if P, then Q. So if true, then true over here. Now remember that the only time this is going to be false is when it says if true, then false. So we can just kind of go through and pick those out. It's going to just be these 2 rows right here where it comes out false. Right? Those are the only times that we have if true, then false. So it's going to be true up here, and it's going to be true for the rest of this. All right, now we have if Q, then R, and notice that's also kind of easy for us because we have Q as our antecedent here, R is our consequent here. If true, then true is true. If true, then false is false. And we know these 2 are going to be true, right? Because they start off with a false antecedent. So those are true, true. Okay, here we have if true, then true, true. If true, then false, this one is going to be false. And then these bottom 2 are going to be true. Okay, so the only time premise 2 comes out false is in these 2 conditions where it says if true, then false, true, then false. All right, now we're going to be looking at the conclusion, if R, then P. This one is a little bit more complicated, or at least it's not as obvious, right? Because we're going from the antecedent as R to the consequent as P. Okay, so let's do this. If true, then true. That's going to be true. If false, look, anytime our antecedent, R, is false, the whole thing's going to come out true because it's a conditional. And the only time a conditional can ever be false is when it says if true, then false. So actually what that means is that I can just kind of go through, take a little shortcut, and write true for every other line here because anytime I have a false antecedent, my conditional is going to be true. Okay, so that means I have to figure it out for right here. So we have if true, then true. That's going to be true. And we have to figure it out for right here. If true, then false. That's going to be false. And we have to figure it out right here. If true, then false. That's also going to be false, right? So it was only these 2 conditions right here. If it says if true, R is true and P is false. If true, then false is false. If true, then false is false. All right, so now we have the truth table completely filled out. This is the first step of doing a truth table for an argument, because the whole purpose of it is to analyze it at the end, right? So we have it all filled up. This is like half of our answer right here because we've shown our work. Now we need to interpret it. So we know that an argument is only valid if it's impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. So what we need to do here is we look to see if there are any scenarios in which both premises, in this case, I say both because there's only 2 premises. If there were 3 premises, we'd be looking for a case where all 3 of them are true and the conclusion is false. So let's go line by line. Pull out my red pen here. All right, so in this first row right here, we have true premises and a true conclusion. All right, so that passes the test. That's not going to tell us whether this is valid or invalid. It's just not going to tell us anything. Okay, so we're looking for whether it's possible for it to have true premises and a false conclusion. Here we have true premise, true conclusion. That passes the test also. Okay, so basically we're looking to see if all of these lines pass the test. Now you might start to notice, look, if we have a true conclusion, why bother looking at the rest? That's not going to tell us anything. The only thing that will tell us anything is whether we find true premises and a false conclusion. So in the cases where our conclusion is true, those pass the test, sure, right? They're not going to tell us anything. They're never going to look like this. True premises and a false conclusion. Sorry if you can see that little recording thing. Okay, they're never going to look like this. True premises and a false conclusion. So that leaves us with 2 lines that we need to look at. And what do you know? This shows us it is possible for this argument, to have true premises and a false conclusion. That is not going to work. I will just underline it, right? So we have that right there and this right here. So wait a minute, no. Right? It is very possible. In fact, there's 2 scenarios in which this argument would have true premises and a false conclusion, meaning that this argument is invalid. Okay, so on your homework or on an exam, what you would need to do is show the truth table, and then you would need to show, look, that you figured it out. Which rows show us that this is invalid? You would have to tell us it's invalid. All right, here is our next argument. I'm going to write it vertically off to the side. Our first premise starts P. If P or Q, then R. Our next premise is not R, and our conclusion is not P. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set up that truth table for us since we've seen that before. Okay, we got our base column started here. I'm going to write P1 for premise 1. P2, I'm writing it in red this time so it stands out a little bit better. And why don't you pause this video and see if you can set up the base columns. I'll give you a second to try that. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so your truth table should look something like this. All right, or it should look exactly like this. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and address each premise individually and the conclusion. So let's start with premise 1. We know that the antecedent is a disjunction, P or Q. So we're going to look here, we're going to look here. Do not pay any attention to R right now. Anytime one of these is true, the whole thing is going to be true because it's a disjunction. So that means we got true, 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 false, false. Okay, and now this is the answer for our antecedent, and R is our consequent. So do not pay any attention to these columns right now. Just look at this first and this second. So antecedent, consequent. First row up here, if true then true is true. If true then false is false. If true then true is true. If true then false is false. If true then true is true. If true then false is false. And we got true, true. All right, so just so that we don't confuse ourselves, we can go through and just erase this. That's just like our extra work. We don't want it to confuse us when we're looking at this at the end. All right, premise 2 is easy because it's just not R, so we're just flipping the truth value. So instead of true, false, etc., goes false, true, etc. Okay, and then same for P. P goes for true, for false, so not P is going to go for false, for true. All right, so now what we're going to do is, because we have everything completed here, so we've done half the problem because we have completed or filled out our truth table. Now what we're going to do is we're going to read it. What is this truth table telling us? Now we don't want to be distracted by anything over here. Remember, these are just our base columns, so they don't matter right now. All we're looking for is whether these show me any cases in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. All right. Does this one pass the test? Yep. Does this one pass the test? Yep. Does this pass the test? Yep. Pass the test? Yep. And notice how all of these ones have true conclusions. That means they're all going to pass the test because they could never look like this. All right. So what we see is that it is literally impossible for this argument to have true premises and a false conclusion, right? We've laid down all the different possible scenarios here, and not one of them leads to this. So that means this argument is valid. Yay! So remember, this is your actual answer about whether or not the argument is valid, but on the exam, we're going to be asking you for the truth table, which means you have to fill this out as well. All right, I hope that was helpful. Good luck.